Great to be here. Thank you very much to the committee for inviting me. As Des said, I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is an educational charity and think tank in Westminster, and we're interested in all of this very much from the perspective of free trade and free markets. What I'm going to talk about is a slight shift away from the fiscal side that we've been focused on and look a bit at some of the regulatory issues to reflect in particular a concern that I have that some of the benefits from the digitalisation and the single trade window projects, which I think are clearly potentially huge, but could potentially also be outweighed by the costs of some of the regulatory barriers that we are looking at, given current government policy on, in particular, conformity assessment and regulatory recognition. Now, what I'm going to do is a quick run through about some of the impact of regulatory barriers and conformity assessment in international trade, and then a quick look at the current position as announced and updated by the government just last week, Monday, and then some thoughts on what might improve the situation if indeed it is still up for grabs in policy terms. So I'm sure I don't have to tell everyone in this room, non-tariff barriers, non-tariff measures, sometimes also known as technical barriers to trade, can apply at the border or behind the border, and it broadly means the regulatory requirements for goods that make it more difficult or more costly to import them into a territory, or in some cases can amount to an outright ban on particular goods. Non-tariff barriers on trading goods between the UK and the EU have been estimated to be the equivalent of an average tariff equivalent of up to 20% for certain goods. And that would really be the most heavily regulated goods, like in particular food and agricultural products. But we're talking material costs here. And these increase the cost of doing business and ultimately, of course, limiting innovation and competition, all of which is passed on to the consumer who pays the price for these increased costs of doing business. Now, the obvious example, as I just referred to, is SPS rules, sanitary and phytosanitary rules that apply to food and agriculture. But today I'm actually going to focus on industrial or manufactured goods. Now, all goods obviously need to meet the local requirements of the market where they are being sold. UK and EU rules require that manufacturers certify that their products meet the requisite standards by applying a specific mark to them. In the case of the EU, that's the CE mark that we're all very familiar with, and the UK has introduced a new UKCA mark for Great Britain. I'm not going to dwell too much on the UK NI mark for the purposes of a short presentation. In most cases, manufacturers can actually self-test and self-certify that the goods are compliant, but for some more specialist goods that are seen to be potentially higher risk, if they are not compliant, you need independent testing and certification by a recognised conformity assessment body. Now, in the EU, of course, these are known as notified bodies. And for third country manufacturers, it's very beneficial if you can get this conformity assessment done by a recognised body in your own country. And that's why countries agree to mutual recognition of conformity assessment. So the WTO, of course, has long recognised the pernicious effects of these technical barriers to trade that arise as a result of discriminatory or disproportionate regulatory requirements. And that's why the WTO members put in place the TBT and SPS agreements to discipline these areas. And countries also often include regulatory cooperation and mutual recognition in bilateral or multilateral, plurilateral free trade agreements, and enter into separate self-standing mutual recognition agreements for conformity assessment in particular sectors like pharmaceuticals, toys, automotive, construction. The EU has mutual recognition agreements in all of those sectors with different countries and territories. Now, it's also possible to get some agreement on recognising the underlying or substantive technical regulations of different countries, as well as just on the formal technical testing and certification processes. But that's much more unusual, certainly outside of the EU single market, and New Zealand and Australia also do that. Now, all of these kinds of agreements and cooperation fora can reduce costs for exporters and importers, and therefore consumers, which benefit their respective economies and encourage innovation and trade. But this kind of mutual recognition, unfortunately, has been pretty limited and inconsistent, often due to a sort of residual protectionism. Once the tariffs goes, vested interests will look for other ways in which they can continue to protect their market share in their home country, and also the desire for countries to preserve autonomy over their own regulations. And there's also, perfectly valid substantive concerns about the different risk appetites of different jurisdictions and their perception and management of risk. And a country might worry that another country's processes for assessing the safety of a good might not include certain requirements and values that the importing country considers to be important. However, there's also the other sort of mercantilist reason, which is to hold off agreeing recognition so you can use it as a bargaining chip in future negotiations, which I'm afraid is potentially what the UK is doing at the moment. So much for the theory then. Where do we stand at present in practice? Slight health warning on this slide. This is a very high-level summary, and we do await the draft legislation that will put last week's announcements and the cumulative sort of policies actually into practice. So this is very much for discussion purposes only. Now, obviously, automatic recognition of regulations for goods and services and their conformity assessment ended as a natural consequence of leaving the EU's internal market. The EU does have the option, as I was just talking about before, to carry on a kind of recognition in the way that it does already give to other countries. But the future relationship negotiations in those future relationship negotiations with the UK, the EU basically declined to continue mutual recognition with us, basically because we wouldn't accept dynamic alignment of the underlying regulations and the continued oversight of the European Court of Justice. Obviously, there is, however, a trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU, but it gives virtually no mutual recognition at all. If I recall correctly, only some partial recognition for some legal services. Of course, we lawyers always manage to look after our own, perhaps, going on there. However, crucially for my purposes today, the TCA does not give mutual recognition to conformity assessment bodies of the two respective parties, so British exporters must still adhere to EU rules and affix the CE mark, and where necessary, have goods retested and recertified with an EU notified body if you were formerly having it done by a UK notified body. And on the other hand, the UK has introduced the new UK CA mark, and we are currently phasing that in for goods on the UK market. And we have continued so far to accept the CE mark and EU regulations on the UK market in recognition of the costs and the impacts on supply chains that the non-recognition of EU rules and marks would have had. Now, various deadlines have come and gone. And what we have last week is effectively this series of grandfathering measures, which seems to come out basically that from January 2023, goods will have to bear the UK CA mark. They can always, of course, continue to carry the CE mark as well. Until 2025, this can be by way of a sticky label or something in the packaging rather than something durably marked on the goods, so existing stock can continue to be run off. You can continue to rely on your EU notified body assessment that has been carried out up to the end of this year to support the application of the UK CA mark until 2027. Now, it's important to note that if you were able to self-declare conformity assessment for the CE marking, you will continue to be able to do that for the UKCA marking, but it looks as though you will be expected to have duplicate files to support this for the two marks. So all in all, a lot of duplication, and although this is better than the guillotine that we were otherwise expecting later this year, this all seems rather suboptimal with a lot of duplication for no good reason, as I say. But the announcement last week specifically recognised that the underlying technical requirements remain largely the same as between the UK and the EU. So what are the benefits to the approach that the UK is taking to ultimately phase out automatic recognition of the CE mark? Obviously, it makes sense to have a UK regulatory framework so that we can potentially control goods if the EU does change its rules, so they're no longer safe, which does seem unlikely, but I suppose we should allow for the theoretical possibility. Or, on the other hand, the more likely possibility that EU rules might be considered to be too restrictive in some cases, and we want to open a route to market for more innovative or less costly goods. But in that instance, it seems to me that we should also continue to allow the EU goods on the market and allow the businesses and consumers to choose between the competing standards, because the CE mark, I would say, is still going to continue to be trusted by consumers and businesses in this country. So it seems to me it doesn't make sense to have a UK-only regime just for the sake of it, or to protect against quite hypothetical risks. And you've probably all seen or even experienced in your own businesses some of the experiences that some importers and retailers are having already with this new arrangement coming in. So I would like to broadly present the case for unilateral openness, which is that British policymakers should continue to recognise the CE mark and certification by EU conformity assessment bodies operating in tandem with the new UKCA mark. And over time, as British and EU regulation might diverge, British regulators could assess whether recognition should be withdrawn, and perhaps if EU regulations are perceived to no longer meet the safety levels expected, then we would no longer have to recognise the mark. Ultimately, the market would then decide which mark is preferred in any particular sector, and in turn, that could actually influence improvements in regulation. And I don't think as well that this would violate non-discrimination commitments in WTO agreements, as long as it's based on a rational risk assessment, and of course that we give equivalent recognition to other jurisdictions that might also meet our same high standards and technical requirements. Very quick note on how this might work with respect to Northern Ireland. The dual regulatory zone that the UK government is pushing for, and indeed is proceeding to legislate for at the moment, should, I would say, logically be applied to the whole UK. And I think this also illustrates the fact that the government wants to continue to recognise both UK and EU regulations for Northern Ireland seems to contradict claims that the UKCA mark is required to protect consumers, because clearly that must surely apply to consumers in Northern Ireland as well, who we are all very happy to continue to have full unrestricted access to EU goods. And whatever the outcome of the current bill or any negotiation with the EU about it, maintaining UK-wide recognition of the CE mark will be beneficial in reducing trade barriers between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, obviously, there are some arguments against this. Just yesterday, by analogy, the Food Standards Authority has called for full border controls on food imports. Slightly different matter to the industrial goods, manufactured goods that I'm talking about here, but it foresees the potential risks in identifying or being able to identify potentially unsafe imports from the EU. Although it's fair to say the industry seems rather divided on how real those risks are. Now, as far as I understand it, the continued unilateral recognition. Let's be clear that, by the way, the reason that this is a problem is because certain business groups and government departments are not keen to give away to the EU unilateral recognition without getting anything in return. But it seems to me that the costs involved in putting up these trade barriers outweigh really the potential benefits to using it as a bargaining chip to persuade the EU to give recognition to our regulations and conformity assessment bodies. So I'm not sure that holding back that negotiating chip is going to be worth it, given the disruption to our own market that we would potentially face. However, I am very keen to hear other arguments against this unilateral approach. I believe the government is still looking at the feasibility of it, as I say, and potentially with regard to other jurisdictions, conformity assessment and other regulations. I think the Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has been very clear that he would see this, the single trade window and the associated trusted trader mechanisms for SPS goods, for example, he would see that as being a global position. So I'd be just very interested to hear about any downsides that businesses like your own might be able to foresee and reasons why the government and other interest groups would be unwilling to continue to accept EU-regulated goods into our market automatically. So I'll leave it there. Happy to take questions now or at the end.
Please, if anyone's got any questions. Mm-hmm. We can then jump on a couple of questions at the end. Thank you very, very much. Mm-hmm.